today on the couch with the series with Dean Karen Webster. And I'm thrilled to have David Clark, globally renowned in the world of interiors and design. And I'm not going to give everything away because as we interviewed David, we talk, you'll get to learn a lot about him.
Good.
So let's jump in. I'm going to actually start, David. I want to kind of delve into your past.
Yes.
And seeing we're on the couch, so this is my therapy session with you. When did you first realise your creative spirit? Were you a creative as a kid growing up?
I was creative as a kid. I grew up in a rugby family, so
really?
I was like the odd one out in my family. But I used to draw a lot as a kid, and I think I can pinpoint exactly when I became interested in design, because we grew up in Brisbane. My family grew up in Brisbane, but my mother was from Sydney. And we used to come down and stay with her aunt Elspeth, my great aunt Elspeth. And Elspeth was married to Arthur Baldwinson, who was one of the unsung heroes of Sydney modernism, one of the early modernists in Sydney, and a great architect. And he had died by the time I was born, but we would come down and stay with Elspeth or visit Elspeth. And she lived in Arthur's house, or the house that Arthur had designed for them, which was a really beautiful modernist gem of a house. And I would go down, this is at the age of 5 or 6 or 7 or something like that. I would go down and sit in Arthur's study, his drawing room, where he had his drawing board and all of his old pens and pencils and his plan drawers. And it looked out through trees down to the water at Greenwich. And I would sit there for hours just playing with his pens and pencils and looking at all the old, it had been left like that since he had died. So it was pretty much as it was, intact. And I think, I sort of would sit there and just absorb this idea of architecture and drawing and design. And I think, that's for me when it all started.
Oh, does the house still exist? Do you know?
Yes, it does still exist. It was heritage listed, and it was bought by a dean of architecture, actually, and she adjusted it and made alterations to it. I liked it better when it was just its simple box, but it does still exist. It's still there.
How wonderful.
Yeah.
It actually reminds me of going to the Saint Laurent Museum in Paris, and his studio, his workroom's been left exactly how it was when he walked out. And it brings tears to your eyes. You see the sharpened pencils there, you see everything still on the desk, and it's quite inspiring.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. And so I think I sort of just absorbed this idea, of design and what a house could be and what modernism could be. And
So was that your first love also with interiors? Because you studied interior design at university.
Not until much later. So when I, through my teens, I used to draw a lot, and I actually used to draw plans when I was 12 and 13 of all sorts of things. But I wanted to study architecture, but at the time, there was a recession in Australia. There were no jobs for architects. Architects were driving cabs. And my mother and father, we sort of talked, and anyway, it was decided that I should study law instead. So I started studying law, which I didn't like at all, and always wanted to be in the architecture school. But at the same time, it was the late 70s in Brisbane, early 80s. I wanted to get out of Brisbane. I wanted to be in Sydney. I wanted to be in a bigger city. I didn't like Brisbane at all, so I left. I finished my commerce degree. I was doing a combined degree. I finished my commerce degree, left Brisbane and came to Sydney, at that stage thinking I'd become a fashion designer.
Okay.
So I came to Sydney, and I ended up working with a company that was a fashion manufacturer and importer, but it was a French couple, and Regine, the other partner in the business, imported very fine French furnishing fabrics. And so I was a little bit involved in the fashion, but became much more involved in the interior furnishing fabrics. And so I spent 10 years probably in the textile industry in Sydney, and then went to London and worked for Designers Guild. And I spent a few years working for Designers Guild there. And then at the age of 30, decided that I would go back to study architecture, which I had always wanted to study. So I did. I came back to Australia and went to architecture school, and I finished my first 3 years and got my design studies degree. And then after that, I sort of got pulled into publishing. So
fascinating. So in your London days, so you got to meet the rather highly recognised Tricia Guild, is it, that runs? Yeah. What was it like working with someone like her?
It was great working with Tricia. I mean, that was a very fond memory for me, a very fond experience, still a very fond working experience. Designers Guild was a very creative company. It ran like a creative family. And, you know, Tricia was very much the force and the power behind it, but it was an exciting time to be a part of that company, because they were sort of coming into their second wave of success in Britain and around the world. And it felt very energetic. You know, it was wonderful working there.
So do you have a love of colour from that time? Yeah.
I do.
Because she was just the queen of colour, and still is, obviously. Yeah, the company. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you kind of moved straight from then your studies into the world of publishing. I'm fascinated in that whole kind of shift, because, you know, around the world, you are so highly regarded for your 10 years as editor of Vogue Living. During your tenure there, you took that magazine to be the preferred interiors magazine, home interiors magazine everywhere. I know you do a little bit work with Edicourt Studio, but I remember working with Lee Edicourt way back in the early 2000s, and they couldn't wait for every episode to come out. And they used to say to me, "You're so lucky in Australia, you've got Vogue Living. It's the best interiors magazine in the world."
That's nice.
And so it's interesting because you made it your own. You know, a lot of other Australian magazines at the time were just copying what was happening internationally, but it actually happened the other way around. And, you know, you were such an inspiration that magazines like Elle Decoration followed your lead rather than the other way around. So how did you make that happen? How did you get into that whole world of editorial? And
so I studied architecture. I went to architecture school in Brisbane at University of Queensland.
Right.
And I had finished my design studies degree, and I was now working with an architect, a Brisbane architect called Elizabeth Watson Brown. And because of my early days in Sydney selling textiles, I used to also deal with all the magazines. So I used to know all of the magazine editors back then. And the editor of Belle at the time, Michaela Dunworth, who I had known, rang me up in Brisbane and said, "I'm looking for a new Brisbane editor. Do you know anybody?" And I said, "Well, what about me?"
Great.
and she said, "Well, can you write?" And I said, "Well, I guess, you know, I can, you know, produce a university essay. So maybe, yeah. I don't know." But anyway, she took a chance. And so I was Brisbane editor for about a year. And then I moved to Sydney, back to Sydney, for the second time, to become design editor of Belle. So I was design editor of Belle, I don't know, 3 years maybe, and then deputy editor of Belle. And then there were a lot of changes, and I left, and I had a few years doing other kinds of work, communications work and marketing work and sales work. Working for, I worked for Space Furniture then, and I'd worked for Spence and Leiter for Fiona Leiter, and did all sorts of things then. The thing which I've enjoyed about my career is that it's shifted perspective. Lots of ways and lots of times through my career. It shifted perspective and shifted location, but always focused around the home and always focused around the interior. So I've acquired a lot of different kinds of knowledge, I guess, around that particular subject. So then once I started in magazines, way back when I was Brisbane editor of Bell, I knew then that I wanted to be an editor. And after this period of doing, maybe 3 years of doing other kinds of work, I thought, right, all I want to do is be editor of either Bell magazine or Vogue Living magazine. So I made a very clear decision then, and then it just sort of unfolded. The interesting thing about that was, and you can apply a bit of magical thinking to this if you like, but when I was a teenager in Brisbane, my family nickname was Mr. Vogue Living. I was always known in my family as Mr. Bogue Living. And so I don't know whether, at that time, maybe there was some kind of subconscious kind of determination that I made in my own mind that was the life that I wanted. I wanted to have a more glamorous life or whatever, escape where I was. So then I started on Vogue Living, and it's a rare opportunity to be on a masthead like that. And I think for me, it was very important to make a magazine of international standing.
Yes. And
that was actually my goal, my own personal goal, because Vogue Living, it had, particularly with Condé Nast and other parts of the world, Vogue Living Australia had often been considered a kind of dowdy cousin, and they didn't think that highly of the Australian consumer or the Australian reader, So I thought, I really want to have a magazine which is equivalent to the best around the world, and in the process of doing that, make an Australian magazine, and allow Australian design to really take a place, a unique place. Because people in other parts of the world found Australian life quite exotic, quite desirable. And so that was the thing that I really wanted to tap into, I suppose. Yeah, so I'm proud of what I did at Vogue Living.
Well, I think you should be. I still have a fairly good selection of all those copies sitting on my bookshelf, because they're not the kind of thing that you can ever throw out. The inspiration is incredible. And it's interesting, like you wanted the magazine to be world class, but I have always felt that what you've also done is spearheaded just Australian design globally. You're an advocate for local talent.
That was really important.
Yeah, sorry.
Did something just come onto the screen there?
No.
Okay. It was really important to me that it be an Australian magazine. It was not going to work for me that it just became a facsimile of other international magazines. So it really had to have a regional feeling. And there was always great work to be found in Australia, and work that deserved to be seen. And I think the other thing which was important to me that was part of the success of the magazine was that I really relied on the Australian diaspora, the people who are around the world, Australians who are really achieving great things creatively, doing very interesting things, they became part of the Bogue Living family in a way.
Right. Yep.
So they would be photographers or writers or producers or, anybody in the creative field. Not necessarily always Australian, but maybe there were people who'd lived in Australia and understood what the Australian sensibility was. So through that network of Australians or Australian-minded people, I found a kind of nuanced aesthetic, I suppose, which populated the magazine. So even the international stories that we found came through that filter.
So you had always an Australian lens. It didn't matter whether you were covering something that was local or international.
Yes.
But what is that distinctive DNA, do you think, or the ethos of Australian design?
It's tricky to put your finger on what it is without resorting to cliches.
Okay. Cliches, things like about the light and things like that.
Course. The light, the kind of relaxed nature of life in Australia.
Yes.
For me, Australian architecture, I think, particularly domestic architecture, is very distinctive. And for me, Australian architecture, the distinction of Australian architecture lives in that space between inside and outside. Mm-hmm. That sort of interstitial space between the indoors and the outdoors. And there's something about the interior that does that as well, I think. But also, from the time that I started in magazines to the time that I finished in magazines, I think the Australian aesthetic changed a lot as well. And when I started, there was very much a kind of sameness to the interiors that we would see, a kind of beigeness.
Yes. More a formula than developing your own personal style. Yes.
Yeah. And so that was another thing that was very important for me on the magazine, was to push this idea of a kind of idiosyncratic quirkiness that was, Australian.
Yeah.
So we'd show high and low projects. We'd show, projects that were creative but made with very little money, to very glamorous projects that were, obviously had a lot of wealth behind them. So the creativity behind the project was always the thing that was the most important thing to me.
And I think that still exists in Australia today, but I think that's why Bogue Living influenced the world, because we did embrace that, and then the world recognised in us something that they started to use as a really strong reference point.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So you moved from Vogue Living to China, working with Architectural Digest.
Yeah, so Condé Nast, Architectural Digest in China are obviously part of the Condé Nast family.
Yeah.
And I was asked to be the international editorial consultant to AD China. So Condé Nast in Europe asked me to consult to the launch of AD in China. So I spent about a year going up and back, helping to set up a new editorial team up there, launch a magazine, basically. They had launched Vogue China and had enormous success with Vogue China. And they were, I think, had just launched GQ China. Mm-hmm. That was also having a big success. So AD was the next one off the rank. So yeah, that was interesting.
An interesting time to be in China, because it was just as, if I've got my kind of years right, it was just as China itself was also really moving into a much more kind of modern, contemporary perspective of where they position themselves in the world and developing their own design ethos.
Yes, and that's exactly why Condé Nast had gone into China. Because China was changing so quickly.
Yeah.
So when was that? That was like 2012, I think.
Yep.
Sound right? Yeah, 2012. I was up there then. So it was a very interesting time. I don't know how the magazine is doing now. I question how a lot of magazines are doing everywhere now. And I wonder about the relevance of magazines actually now.
That's actually a really important question to ask you because, you know, at a click of our fingers, we get information now.
Mm.
And, you know, even though there's still a beauty in turning a page, I think there's probably people seek out books and things for that. But the idea of the magazine for that, and also the plethora of kind of home renovation shows on television, all of those things. Do we now look for other sources for our inspiration for interiors?
Well, I don't look at magazines at all anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably haven't for at least 5 years. I do buy beautiful books. I like, regardless of whether, because I'm just looking at a whole shelf of books here, of beautiful interiors books, most of which I've only flicked through. You know,
Yes.
I haven't really pored over them, but I like having them there.
Yes.
And then obviously online. And the thing that I like about online is that you can see so many more pictures very quickly. And I loved making magazines. Making magazines was, for me, a craft which I really enjoyed. And making a story, you know, was a really beautiful thing to do. But I like now the speed of being able to just flick through 50 pictures rather than 12 in a
Yes.
magazine story, and seeing so much more. So I think,
Where do you go for inspiration then?
well, it just sort of hits me now. I mean, I subscribe to some websites, or I get the newsletters, right? So Arc Daily is one that I like a lot.
Yes.
Design Boom.
Yes.
There are probably some others, but I don't really have time. But it just still seems to get through. And I will follow particular people, I suppose, and analyze their work more deeply. The other thing was, you know, I would go to Milan every year for Design Week, and you see everything there. So that was always a great inspiration as well.
Nothing like it, is there, the Milan Design Week? And we take a group of students up to Milan every year, so we're completely disappointed that we've not had that experience. But I think it's only going to make everyone hungrier for next year, for 2021, to make it bigger, better, bolder, and more interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
So a little bit about what you're doing now, because I describe you as the modern day Renaissance man. You seem to have this capacity to do an enormous number of things, from consulting through to design work to, you know, I've watched you do those fantastic trend forecasting sessions with Philip Fermano from Trend Union. Always inspirational. You're a correct curator. Like, can you share for us what a typical week might be for David Clark?
Well, it's hard at the moment, right? Because at the moment I'm in my apartment looking at the water, and that's mostly what I'm doing at the moment, because you know, you're in isolation. So at the moment, a typical week is not very typical. But if I think back to you know, the projects that I have been doing, the thing that I get most satisfaction from is sitting at the drawing board. You know, I actually love, and you know, when I studied architecture, I learnt pencil on paper,
Yes.
and I think maybe there was a semester of CAD at the very end, but I never learnt CAD really. So I find drawing with pencil on paper on a drawing board really therapeutic and meditative, and I'm happy. to sit there and nut out a design problem, or work out a plan and work out a layout and so on, doing that. I have a kitchen that's just been finished up at a friend's house up in Paddington, so I've been walking up there and just checking out the details on that. We've just had some stucco work done in a little powder room, so that had to be checked. And I go out to the joiner, which I love doing because I love going to see where people make things and spending time with the makers and really nutting out a detail.
Yes.
That also is very satisfying. I did a big interior with Kai Lu. Kai Lu, who's an Adelaide-based, very fine furniture designer. I'm sure you have heard of Kai.
Fantastic work. Yeah.
He designed this house, and he pulled me in to work on the interiors with him. So we did that over several years, and I've just had a piece made by an antique restorer up a few hours or a couple of hours north of Sydney. So going up to see him in his workshop, and we spend 20 minutes working out the curve of a leg. It's fantastic, all that sort of detail and attention to quality is something that really makes me very excited. And I do some communications work still for design companies or design-led companies, like company brochures, that sort of thing. Yes. I've been working again with Fiona Lyder, who I used to work with 20 years ago, maybe. So I've been working on a couple of design projects with her, a new showroom for her and a display apartment that she's been doing. So it's mostly interiors work, which I enjoy.
Do you think there's a return to this appreciation of the artisan? Like just listening to you talk about the joiner and the craft of making. Do you think that we're going through a really surreal moment in our history at the moment where we've had to learn how to contemplate and reflect again and understand the world around us? We're immersed in our homes, so we're seeing that just how many people have collected crap over the years, and do you start to appreciate things like your books again? I maybe I'm internally optimistic, but I am hoping that out of the other side of this, we will have an appreciation for the make and the craft and the design.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's very clear that out of this will come a reappreciation of the domestic economy. So I've always believed that we need to make more things in Australia.
Yes.
And then unless you make your own things, then you aren't really a nation state. You need to make what you need for your society and your culture. So Australian manufacturing has it's been disappearing. In the furniture industry, I think it's the weak link in Australian design, and now I think there'll be a reappreciation of Australian making, Australian industry, Australian manufacturing, and that will be good. And we'll start to develop a domestic economy again.
So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about you, because you're on the board of the Design Institute of Australia. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you are admitted to their Hall of Fame, which is a tribute to what you have contributed to the Australian design landscape. You're also made an honorary of the Australian Design Centre. So you are an advocate for Australian design. We're just talking about, this appreciation, this craft. What opportunities do you see for Australian designers, especially on the global stage? How do we? Does that even matter?
No.
Or no?
I don't think it matters. I think it pre-COVID. I think, Australian design on the global stage was important, but now I don't think it is important.
Right.
I think what's more important now is Australian design for the domestic economy, and that Australian designers think of ways that they can get their product into a domestic market more efficiently, more effectively, more deeply. I think that's what's important, and I have this conversation with Adam Goodrum,
Yes.
quite a lot, and Adam, along with some other designers, was one of the first to really get some attention internationally, and that was always their focus. They always went. All of the Australian designers, they went to Milan. They go every year, and they would try and get a gig with one of the big international furniture houses. But now, Adam, for instance, is making with Colt, designing. It's locally made, and they're having great commercial success with that. So he now can see that he's the commercial potential of the domestic furniture market. And I think a lot of Australian designers can see that now. And more companies and manufacturers are seeing the value of Australian designers, and producing something which is designed here, made here, sold here.
So, getting that global recognition is more of a side bonus, because do you think that the industry, we've got a buoyant enough industry here to support local design? It's
always the challenge, because of the size of the Australian market, but
yeah.
But I think also, we've been living in a very greedy time for a long time, and I think now what's important is less greed, a little bit more frugality, a little bit more modesty, just not wanting to have as much, but just having enough. And if everybody starts to think, okay, well, I don't need to, make all this money out of this so that I can buy another car or, fly first class to Europe or whatever, then maybe things will adjust.
It'll shift, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that will be one of the big outcomes of the time we've been through at the moment as well.
So if you were to commission someone to design for you, like you obviously got the capacity to design your own space, your own interiors, would you be seeking out Australian designers, or do you have someone who you would love to work with?
There are too many people, really, that I would love to work with. Too many, and if there are many Australian architects that I would love to commission to design something, because I think Australian architects are really very accomplished.
We've got some awesome architects here in Australia, just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And they need to be given bigger projects. You have all of these international commissions or big cultural projects, and it's always an international competition where somebody from overseas has to come in and work with a local architect. I think why? Why not just make it an Australian competition? Why not just, develop your own creative and aesthetic culture? Melbourne has been good at that, and I think, in my mind, it's probably Leon van Schaik who really was instrumental in that, because he was in a position of power where he could maneuver for Melbourne architects to get Melbourne commissions. So you have this like microcosm of architecture in Melbourne, which is kind of odd. It's sort of, architect friends from a university in Chicago came to visit. They went to Melbourne for the first time, and they came back in Sydney, and they said, Melbourne's a bit like a petting zoo for architecture. And I understood exactly what he meant. But for me, that's a good thing, because there's something distinctive about architecture in Melbourne. And it becomes its own creative culture. And that can only be good, I think.
That's fascinating. I've been privileged to work alongside Leon when I worked at RMIT for many years. So it was incredible to have his influence and his inspiration around. Doesn't suffer fools easily, which is probably one of his strengths as well, I think. But how important do you think it is for a city to have its own, kind of aesthetic or its own DNA again? That we constantly compare Melbourne and Sydney, but for us living in Melbourne, we do have a real sense of pride about our creative ethos.
Totally. And I think that comes from what we've just been talking about. There is a kind of as you just said, an appreciation for your own creativity. I think it's critical. Yeah. It's critical. If you don't have it, then you just become a facsimile of many other places around the world, and your distinction gets lost, your regionalism gets lost, your unique quirkiness gets lost. Quirkiness is one of the words that I use a lot when I describe Australian design, because I think it's the quality that we actually now need to cultivate.
Yes.
It's our quirkiness. It's sort of thing.
Because it's the twist, isn't it? That it gives it and it makes something collectible that it tells a story if it's got a sense of quirk about it. Yeah. Absolutely. So I was going to ask you a question about, because I'm in the world of education at LCI, I'm really keen to know what's next for the next generation coming through. So in light of all of that, what kind of advice, I know this is a really big question, but, what would you suggest or advise to graduates today? What's the gem that you can share with us?
I don't know if there's a gem that you can share, really, is there? I mean, it's such a turbulent time for everything, but design particularly has a role in this, because, and it's one of the things that I grapple with, is, do I care about Mrs. So-and-so's curtains, or whether the very expensive chair coming from Paris is late? I don't know. There are a whole lot of problems in the world right now, and I don't need to list them all. We know what they all are, but design needs to have a place in this, in trying to contribute to the solution of these problems. I think eventually we'll start to see a new aesthetic emerge, which will come from climate awareness, new materials technology, which is all about protecting the climate, recycling, etc., etc. There'll be an aesthetic which comes from that. Part of it will be the handmade again as well. It's a big question. I think one of the most interesting people on this at the moment is Alice Rawsthorne.
Yes.
Who has written several books, but her last book is probably a good book for people to read. And she gave a lecture in Canberra a couple of years ago, and she really demoted aesthetics from the design equation now. I think we've always talked about, if you think about the Vitruvian definition of architecture, it's commodity, firmness, and delight, right? So aesthetics have had equal billing in those things. She seemed to be suggesting now that aesthetics didn't matter as much, that actually we needed to solve problems. We needed to come up with solutions that were like engineering solutions, and we needed to deal with big questions that were really affecting the planet. So, where the question is, where does interior design or interior decorating fit?
Yes.
And I think that's not something I can't answer right now, but it's a good question to ask. And I think if you're in the interior design industry now, you need to be asking that question, because out of that question will come what the next iteration, if you like, of interior design is.
It's a challenge we say to our students. We are not the problem, but we are part of the solution. And that's the beauty of creative thinking, critical thinking. And yes, I agree, across all the design disciplines, I think we are part of that future.
Yeah.
And we've got to embrace. I think the next generation coming through are pretty exciting. They're motivated, they're politicized again, they're mobilized, and they do want to make a difference. They get frustrated with our generation because we probably stuff things up a little bit. So I say go get it. That's awesome. So I'm going to finish up with one final question. What next for David Clarke?
Who knows? I don't know.
Are you at the crossroads? Are you making big life decisions, or are you just in reflection mode at this stage?
Reflection mode. I mean, I think it was quite timely when the COVID virus first took hold and we started isolating. I get Nick Cave's red hand files. I don't know if you know about them.
Yes, yeah.
Started this correspondence with his fans, where fans would write in and ask him questions, and he would write a letter back to them. And this is something that he publishes. And so, at the beginning of the isolation, he was asked by a couple of fans what he was going to do in the isolation and what sort of creative output we could expect from him. And he said, normally I would think about what I'm going to do creatively, but this time I'm thinking we're in a moment of history. As a creative person particularly, I just want to sit back and observe and reflect and just watch this unfold. And that made sense to me. So I think it is a time for reflection and really just to think about what's coming next. And I don't know what's coming next yet. I mean, what I am excited about is this idea that we've been talking about, that the domestic economy becoming important again, and that we'd start to see more things made again.
Well, that's absolute inspiration for the next generation coming through, because it shows a respect for what they are capable of doing. And I, like you, would love to see a resurgence of manufacturing back in Australia. And I know there's a cost associated with that in terms of resourcing, etc. But if we can, I think that the artisan aspect of design has to be appreciated. We've kind of car parked that over here somewhere as everything's been produced in these fast big factories somewhere else in the world. Definitely a future in that space for all of us.
It doesn't have to be big manufacturing.
No,
it can be small. It can be one of the things which when I visited Belgium and Antwerp in particular, and I just left there with this great sense that this was a society of little boutique makers making beautiful things, useful things for their own culture. And that was a very strong sense, that you could be that. You could just be a collective of, I don't know.
Of creatives, yes.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Antwerp is inspirational, less than it's about 500,000 population, but look at their outputs. It's absolutely incredible. So they are a space.
Yeah.
Okay, so David, we're going to finish it up there. And all I can say is that was absolutely inspirational. Thank you very much. And thanks for joining me on the couch.
You're welcome.
My pleasure.